When the United Interstellar Housing Authority matched me with a roommate from the Kaltari Concord, I expected glowing skin, 3 elbows, and a refrigerator policy that would start a small war. I did not expect a laminated clipboard titled Reproductive Curiosity, Cross-Species Ethics, Volume 3 to be propped against our sink like a shrine. Nor did I expect my new roommate, Tlari, to announce on day 1, very calmly, very academically, that she intended to observe human courtship behaviors in a controlled domestic environment. I was 30, a systems tech for orbital elevators, and my life was a routine of coffee, cables, and quiet evenings. Tlari was taller than me, luminous in the soft way a moonlit lake is luminous, with eyes that reflected like polished obsidian. The Concorde had sent her as a cultural liaison. Earth had sent me a checklist and a welcome basket that included tea I didn't drink. Our apartment had 2 bedrooms, a common room, and a window that showed the slow ballet of ships threading the sky. We agreed on chores. We disagreed on whether music should be audible beyond a single room. And we both agreed that honesty would make things easier. Human honesty, Tlari said, tapping her clipboard with a slender finger, is a fascinating variable. You perform it like an art form. I laughed because it felt like the right response. We mostly fake it and hope for the best. She studied me with an intensity that made the air feel tuned. Your species survives by hope? Among other things. Caffeine helps. She wrote that down. For weeks, our life was a pleasant orbit. I taught her how to make toast without summoning the smoke detector. She taught me how to fold Kaltari garments that refused to acknowledge gravity. We shared stories, my childhood near the coast, her apprenticeship in a city grown inside a crystal reef. The word breeding stayed on the clipboard like a fossil, but she never pointed to it. Instead, she asked about dates, about why humans used flowers as apologies, about the peculiar bravery of asking someone to dinner and risking a no. You treat consent as ritual, she said one night while calibrating the apartment's climate to something she called brisk optimism. It is beautiful. It's necessary, I said. And it's only brave if you mean it. She nodded, and I wondered what it looked like to mean things on a world where most decisions were made by committee and probability curves. The first time things shifted was over soup. I had made a simple tomato basil, and she had brought out a Kaltari spice that smelled like rain after heat. We ate in companionable silence until she set her spoon down and said, "I have an ethical inquiry." "Those are my favorite kind," I said, which was a lie, but a friendly one. On my world, reproduction is communal. Pairing is rare. When it occurs, it is for reasons of resonance. Humans seem to pair for reasons that include resonance, but also narrative. She tilted her head. You tell stories about yourselves and then try to live inside them. We're stubborn like that. She considered me, and there was warmth there, the kind that made the room feel less like a rental and more like a place that kept our footsteps. I am curious, she said carefully, about whether resonance can be cultivated. The word hung between us like a bridge in fog. Cultivated how? I asked. By proximity. By shared labor. By shared risk. By consent, she added quickly. Always by consent. I felt a familiar human mix of flattery and caution. Are you asking me on a date, Tlari? Her eyes brightened, a subtle shimmer like bioluminescence under deep water. If that is the ritual word, yes. For the purpose of observation. And also, she paused, a rare hesitation. For the purpose of seeing what happens to the narrative. We went to a little rooftop place that grew herbs in recycled light. The sky was a map of traffic and stars. We talked about home and about what we missed. She asked me why humans laugh when nervous, and I told her because silence can feel like judgment. She told me Keltari laugh, because it feels like relief. We shared dessert. Nothing dramatic happened, and everything did. After that, our apartment shifted again. We still argued about music volume. We still left notes about who bought the last of the oat milk. But sometimes our hands brushed in the hallway, and we didn't rush to catalog it. Sometimes we sat closer than necessary and pretended we were studying the same page. Sometimes we watched the sky and said nothing and felt like that was the point. The clipboard remained. One evening, I found her staring at it, frowning. "Problem?" I asked. "Translation," she said. "Your word, breeding, carries connotations that my language does not intend. It sounds transactional, extractive. I do not wish to reduce us to that." I leaned against the counter. On Earth, that word is mostly used for animals, or in bad science fiction. If you mean a relationship, we have better words. "Which one do you prefer?" she asked genuinely. I thought about it. "Choice," I said. "Or maybe partnership." She wrote both down, then slid the clipboard into a drawer like a secret. "Thank you." The Concord sent a survey a week later. It was all checkboxes and margins that assumed clean answers. Tlari sat at the table, stylus hovering. "Question 12, she said. "Have you experienced interspecies resonance? Please quantify." I laughed. "We're bad at quantifying feelings. Your species seems to specialize in them." We decided to answer with a story instead. It wasn't part of the form, but she attached it anyway. A paragraph about soup. A sentence about rooftop herbs. A footnote about shared silence. She sent it off and looked both relieved and terrified. "You okay?" I asked. "On my world," she said, "this would be considered radical." "On ours too," I admitted. "But we're pretty good at being radical when it counts." There was a moment then, a quiet gravity. She reached out, paused, and waited. I nodded. Our hands met, warm and careful. No fireworks. No orchestra. Just two people choosing the same next step. We didn't rush. That was important to her and to me. We talked about boundaries, about expectations, about what each of us wanted from whatever this was becoming. We learned each other's tells. The way she grew very still when thinking, the way I filled silence with jokes when anxious. We learned that learning itself could be a kind of intimacy. When the Concord requested a formal report on cross-species reproductive feasibility, Tlari closed the message without opening it. "Do you want to talk about that?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "And I want to change the terms. Feasibility suggests an outcome is owed. I want possibility." I liked that. Possibility sounds like us. We drafted a response together. It said, "Any exploration of shared future must begin with consent, continue with curiosity, and accept that outcomes are not obligations." We sent it. The sky did not fall. The stars kept their appointments. There were nights we stayed up too late, trading stories until the apartment lights dimmed themselves. There were mornings we rushed and forgot breakfast and laughed about it later. There were small arguments and sincere apologies. There was a growing sense that the space between us was no longer a gap, but a room we were furnishing together. One evening, after a long day that had been unkind to both of us, she stood in the doorway to my room and said, "I am still learning your rituals. I do not wish to misstep." "You won't," I said. "And if you do, we'll talk about it." She smiled, that quiet moonlight smile. On my world, that would be considered a promise. On ours too. We sat on the edge of the bed and talked. About fear. About hope. About the strange courage of choosing each other in a universe that made no guarantees. When we leaned in, it was slow and deliberate, like agreeing to read the same book. We paused when either of us needed to. We kept the lights low. The rest of the story is ours, and it's enough to say that we chose each other again in the morning. The Concord replied weeks later. They thanked Tlari for her innovative narrative approach and asked for metrics. She sent them a picture of our herb pots thriving under borrowed sunlight. Metrics, she said dryly. Human bureaucracy and alien committees have more in common than either likes to admit. But something changed in the questions they sent after that. Less extraction. More listening. We started hosting dinners for neighbors who were curious in the best way. A miner from Ganymede brought bread that could survive re-entry. A teacher from Nairobi brought stories. A courier with tired eyes brought laughter that filled the room. Tlari listened, asked, learned. So did I. Our apartment became a little embassy where the only requirement was respect. One night, after everyone left, she stood by the window and said, "Your species has a saying. We are what we choose." "Yeah," I said. "We steal it from better thinkers and put it on mugs." She considered the traffic and stars. "I choose you," she said simply. My chest did that human thing where it forgets how to be a machine for a second. "I choose you too." We never did put the word breeding back on the table. We talked about futures instead. About trips to crystal reefs and coastal towns. About whether we wanted plants that required names. About how to build a life that could survive committee meetings and rainy days. When the Concord invited us to present at a symposium, Tlari asked if I would come. I said yes because some choices are obvious once you've practiced making them. We stood in a hall that hummed with languages and light, and she told our story like a scientist who had learned to write poetry. There were questions. There were arguments. There were also nods that felt like doors opening. After, someone asked me what it was like to be human in all of this. I thought about soup and herbs and a clipboard in a drawer. "It's like this," I said. "We're not the strongest. We're not the oldest. But we're stubborn about choosing each other. And sometimes that's enough to change the shape of a room. Or a policy. Or a future." On the flight home, Tlari leaned against me and said, "Your narratives are contagious." "So are yours," I said. Back in our apartment, the plants were taller. The sky was the same. We unpacked and laughed at the way we always overpacked. We made soup with rain-smelling spice. We sat by the window and planned nothing and everything. If you asked the Concord, they would file us under ongoing study. If you asked Earth, it would probably make a streaming series and get the details wrong. If you ask me, I'd say it's simple and complicated in the way all good stories are. Two adults, choosing with care. And if you asked Tlari, she would smile that moonlight smile and say, "We are not a conclusion. We are a possibility that keeps agreeing to itself." The real test didn't come from the Concord's questions. It came 3 days after we returned home. The message arrived while we were eating breakfast, her version of breakfast anyway, which involved nutrient crystals that clicked softly between her teeth. My human toast suddenly felt very fragile when the apartment's hollow display lit up with the seal of the Keltari Concord. Tlari froze. I didn't need to ask. I could see it in the way her shoulders tightened, in the way her bioluminescent patterns dimmed just a little. "They want a decision," she said quietly. "About what?" I asked, though I already had a bad feeling. "About me," she replied, "and about us." The message was brief and brutally formal. The Concord had reviewed her symposium presentation, her reports, and the anomalous emotional variables she had introduced into what was supposed to be a clinical study. Their conclusion was simple. Tlari could continue her work, but not here. She was being recalled to Keltar Prime. Permanently. I felt something hollow open up in my chest, like gravity had briefly turned off and forgotten to come back. "And what happens to this?" I asked, gesturing vaguely at the apartment, the window, the life we'd been building out of shared groceries and shared silences. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and her voice softened. They believe this phase of the study is complete. Phase, I repeated a little bitterly. She reached for my hand, not to me. We sat there for a long time without speaking. The city outside kept moving. Ships kept threading the sky. The universe, as usual, did not pause for personal crises. Finally, I asked the question that scared me most. Do you want to go? She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was steady, but honest. I want my world to understand what I've learned, she said. I want them to stop thinking of connection as something that can be measured and packaged. I want them to see that choice changes things. Then she squeezed my hand. But I also want to stay with you. We both knew what that meant. Staying wouldn't just be a romantic decision. It would be political, complicated, risky for her career, maybe even for her standing in the Concord. Humans like to pretend love exists in a vacuum. It doesn't. It exists in paperwork and borders and expectations. That night, we didn't make grand speeches. We cooked together. We washed dishes together. We sat by the window and watched the sky like we always did. At some point, she said, on my world, leaving would be considered the logical choice. And on mine, I said, we're really bad at only doing the logical thing. She smiled at that. The next morning, she sent her reply. Not a refusal. Not a resignation. A counterproposal. She offered to remain as a permanent liaison. Not as a subject. Not as an observer. But as a bridge, someone who lived the reality of interspecies partnership instead of just writing about it. She made it clear that this was not an experiment. It was her life. The Concord didn't answer right away. Days passed. Then weeks. We went on living because that's what you do when the future is uncertain. You keep watering the plants, you keep buying groceries, you keep choosing each other in small, ordinary ways. I won't pretend I wasn't scared. I was terrified. But every time I thought about her leaving, I realized something. Whatever happened, this wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a phase. It wasn't data. It was real. And real things change you, even if they don't last forever. Then one evening, the message came. Approved. With conditions, of course. Committees always need conditions. Reports would be required. Oversight would exist. Politics would never fully go away. But Tlari could stay. She read the message twice, then looked at me like she wasn't entirely sure the universe wasn't playing a prank. I believe, she said slowly, that this is what humans call a win. I laughed, and for the first time in weeks, it didn't feel forced. I pulled her into a hug, and she held on like someone who had just decided, very deliberately, where home was. Later that night, as the city lights reflected in the window and the sky traffic traced familiar paths, she rested her head against my shoulder. On my world, she said softly, they will write about this as a case study. And on mine, I replied, we'll probably just call it a relationship. She made that quiet, warm laugh of hers, the one that always sounded like relief. We're still a possibility, she said. Yeah, I agreed. But we're a pretty good one. Out there, among the stars, species would argue and study and debate what we were. In here, in this small apartment with mismatched cups and stubborn plants and a window full of moving lights, we already knew the answer. We weren't an experiment. We weren't a headline. We were two people who chose each other again and again, and decided that was more powerful than any conclusion the universe could try to write for us.